Welcome to the Scholar Chronicles. This is Dr. Lokeas, a historian, and in this podcast, I ask fellow scholars to share their stories from the field, from their research. These stories are commonplace, multiple, numerous, but rarely shared in public and discussed. But I think they are interesting because they shed light on the research we do, the challenges we face, and the relationship between scholarship and society. The hope for this podcast is that sharing these stories and discussing these stories will help us do our research a little bit better. Very happy to have with us our guest for today, a scholar that I heard of and knew from our previous guest, actually, Tan Teng Fee, who was on to talk about the new villages in Malaysia. And I believe one of the examiners for his dissertation was our guest today, Francis Low. Francis, morning, how are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. Penang is, I'm in Penang, so we're not so far apart. Yeah.
I kind of mapped out a few things that we can discuss. The first thing is, I want to go back to your doctoral days and have you talk about being at Cornell, and which was at the time in the late 70s, I think, kind of the academic mecca of Southeast Asian studies, right? I want to talk about your time at Cornell and who were there and the kind of Southeast Asian studies that was being conducted. And then I want, of course, talk about the main meat of your research on the Malaysian squatters and new villages, as well as your foray into other aspects of Malaysian studies. You're one of the authorities in Malaysian studies, researching Malaysia, teaching in Malaysia, and so on. And finally, I think underlying all of these research and teaching and your public engagement is your role, which I very much admire, right, as what you call a scholar activist in Malaysia. And that is become almost as important as your academic work. Let me start with Cornell. And what was the thinking behind going to Cornell?
You want me to also introduce myself a bit?
Yes,
Yeah.
please. I kind of skipped that.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm a Penang boy, who grew up here that's 73 years ago. I was born in 1951. And I went to school here in a school called St. Xavier's Institution. It's the oldest LaSalle school, in the region, together with St. Joseph's Institution in Singapore, founded the same year. And the only place I had visited prior to going to America was actually just going to Singapore. But I left here in 1970 and I moved to America to do my studies. I come from a very middle class English educated family, um, you know, and this is Penang. And Penang in those days was not very, very different from the ambience of Singapore or Hong Kong. We were all sort of like former British colonies, but we were also harbor principalities, so to speak. So this was the milieu that I grew up in. The education system, very colonial style. A lot of Irish Catholic brothers, who gave us excellent education, but also steeped us, imbued us with their ethos, Lassallean Christian ethos. Yeah.
What
So
was
anyway,
that ethos? I don't know about that ethos.
the ethos was, the mission was created for actually for the poor and needy students. You know, it started in France, but then when they became missionaries, took the mission outside of France. It was to provide education for the young, poor, and needy, throughout the world, and that continues to be their tradition today. Yeah.
Would
So
you say that kind of from your childhood, right, from your younger days, instill a certain awareness of the less fortunate people in society?
Oh yeah, that's very, very
Mm,
much so.
mm,
Um, I might just want to mention, so this is one of the things that I did not so long ago was I was commissioned by the LaSalle mission in Malaysia to actually do a consultancy for them about the way forward. So it's and I told we ended up by saying that we reinvigorate the schools because Malaysian schools, unlike in Singapore, they've fallen under the control of the government, who set the curriculum, who determine who become your teachers, who are your headmasters, and so on and so forth, and who comes to attend your school. You don't have the right to determine. They've lost that kind of autonomy. So I said, no, let's reinvigorate that by establishing very good boards, of governance. And then the next thing was to launch new initiatives. Perhaps you want to do a private international school. In Singapore, they've got St. Joseph's International now. So maybe you want to do a St. Xavier's International. And actually, they've done a St. John's International in Kuala Lumpur. And the third, option was we commit ourselves to the education of the poor and needy. So that remains a constant, so we did that. So it's something that I picked up, it's part of me today. I'm very concerned about this option for the poor, and yeah. And I suppose the other legacy from my education days is that I decided to become a teacher. I was very, inspired by the teachers who taught me, both the Irish, brothers and all that, but also the lay teachers who were local, unmarried, married people. So they also, they were influenced by by the Irish brothers, and in turn, both sets of people influenced me. So I'm very proud that I'm a teacher, and it all started way back then. Yeah. Well, I actually didn't go to Cornell immediately. My first degree was at Dartmouth College. And Dartmouth is also one of these, Ivy League, very elitist, excellence institutions. So I stayed there for 4 years. And that was the period, this whole period was the Vietnam War. And so I sort of like stumbled into this war that America was conducting. And these years were actually very, very formative for me. Not just the Dartmouth years, but also the Cornell years. So the entire period of the 1970s. I started in 1970, I came back in 1979. So this period was very formative. In a sense, this was a period when the world was in turbulence, especially vis-a-vis academia, because recall in that period you had student uprisings in the LSE, in the Sorbonne, and even in our region, you had the Indonesian students, the Thai students, Hong Kong, and people in Tokyo, they were all fighting, demonstrating, and of course in Korea as well. So this was the turbulence that was taking place, and people were perhaps, um, egged on because of what was happening in terms of the American war in Vietnam, and which was sort of like expanding from Vietnam. I went into the rest of Indochina, and this was related to the Cold War. This was the Cold War, and China was in turbulence. Even you had the Cultural Revolution taking place, and um, so I had a
mm,
private question of my own. I had left Malaysia in 1970, shortly after the May 13 ethnic riots, communal riots. So I wanted to understand, now that I distanced myself from Malaysia, I wanted to understand what happened in Malaysia. Why did that occur? But it coincided with this larger question of, hey, why is this world in such turbulence? I'd gone to America to go and study and all that,
mm,
but all the time there were all these demonstrations taking place on campus. And I recall also there was this huge, massive um, gathering in Washington, D.C. and at the Capitol, and and I tagged along. Didn't understand 100% what was going on, but I tagged along because there was a free ride to Washington, and you just began to get awakened in this manner. So this was the turbulence that was taking place.
Can I just jump in here? Your university, your first degree, right? Was that at University of Malaya or was that at USM?
No, it was, I said, at this college called Dartmouth.
Okay. You didn't
So I
study
did
in
my first,
Malaysia.
I didn't study in Malaysia at all. I had
Okay.
a scholarship, so I went to, this Ivy League school called Dartmouth. It is the smallest of the Ivy League schools, and it is actually in a rural setting, unlike, say, Harvard, which is in Boston, Columbia in New York City, UPenn in Philadelphia. This is actually in the backwaters, of New England, in the New Hampshire. So that was my first degree, and suddenly you go to classes, and suddenly a friend of yours, a classmate of yours, um, tells you he's going to have to go to America. He has to go to Vietnam to go and fight a war, and he's very reluctant to go. But this was the American draft system. And today it's a voluntary army. You join, but last time you were drafted into the army. And so this guy, and I had some friends at Dartmouth who actually went to Vietnam, and they never came back. Apparently, they died. They were killed there in action. But some came back and they became activists protesting against the war because it had disrupted their life. And if you remember, maybe you might not recall, but the spirit of 70s was, on the one hand, this anti-war peace movement, but it was preceded by a period of much upheaval in America because of the black people beginning to demand their rights. There was the so-called civil rights movement. So Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. This was that period. So if you are anybody who's a bit sensitive, and in America at that point in time, you just get, awakened, and you want to begin to ask the question, what the hell is happening in this place? So, and things like the gay movement and the women's movement also began to emerge. And at Dartmouth, which is committed to the education of the Native Americans, the Indians, there was an uprising among these Native Americans, and they themselves. So this was on my campus itself. So all these things happen, and so you get awakened, and you want to begin to study this. It coincided with actually, I joined a semester abroad program, which brought me out to Southeast Asia. So I went to America. I discovered that I realized so little about my country, and I began to ask a lot of questions which I didn't used to ask, because now I was, egged on by what was happening in America. So I joined this semester abroad program, and it was the first time when I had this opportunity to actually travel the region. And my sojourn actually started in Singapore. We used to stay in this and held our classes in the YMCA in Palmer Road near Keppel Harbour area. So we used to do that, or maybe it was the YWCA. The other one is near the Canning Hill. So anyway, it was here that we had our classes, and then subsequently we had almost a month off to go and do research. So that allowed me to actually travel up north to Thailand, and finally to Chiang Mai. This was all first time. I'd never gone to these places. And then finally, the program met again in Yogyakarta. And then we ended up, this 6-month program or 5-month program in Bali. Subsequently,
what do you mean you had classes in Southeast Asia? You traveled to Southeast Asia for your classes?
No, this was the Southeast Asia a semester abroad program.
Ah, okay, I see.
So, because Dartmouth didn't offer Southeast Asian studies, I applied for this program and joined this inter university. So this was actually coordinated by the University of Hawaii,
Uh,
and which had a Southeast Asia program. And they then brought students enrolled in different programs from Tulane University, from Brown University, from Dartmouth. And you must have the means, lah. Either your own pocket or you had, your parents or the university will have to subsidize you. So we then came out here for 5 months to Southeast Asia. So since this was an opportunity for me to actually get to know my own region and to come back, so I jumped at this opportunity, So I came, and it was 5 months or 6 months, because I stayed on, just awakening. And I began to know the region, but I also began to I decided after this that this was an area of studies that I wanted to invest the rest of my life in. I decided prior to this, I'd gone to America to study medicine. But, after doing this, I decided, hey, I'm not going to become a doctor.
mm,
I'll become a Southeast Asianist. Of course, my mother was very disappointed, but, you know, um, I decided I wanted to do this. So this was, in a sense, a very important period. So by the time I went to Cornell, I had decided this is why I'm going to Cornell. I'm going to go to enroll in a sense, what you say, the Mecca in Southeast Asian studies. And I wanted to go and study with these two personalities that I had been introduced to. On the one hand, George Kahin, the in a sense, he was the doyen of Southeast Asian studies then, and his student called Ben Anderson. So I would end up, studying with both of them, and it was very nice because over there, this program of Southeast Asian studies was very well funded. So I got another fellowship, and but it also attracted not just American students, but a lot of students from Japan, and a few Indians who wanted to study Southeast Asia. Plus, of course, because of Ford Foundation and Asia Foundation, Rockefeller, they were giving out these fellowships to Southeast Asian students. You also began to, interact with a lot of Southeast Asian students. So it was a wonderful program. There were people who grew up in the region, but there are also people who were ex-Peace Corps and all that, who wanted to now get into this subject matter. So I spent 4 years there, and it coincided with the American War was winding down. The peace talks and the Hanoi peace talks was held in 1974. So the war wind down. But there occurred, like the 1973 student uprising in Thailand, and this democratic revolution took place, allowed for democratic governments to take over from the military for 2-3 years. And then in 1976, there was a coup d'etat. So there was a lot of turbulence in Thailand. And so I was in the thick of this, and I could see, my Thai students and the professors, who were studying Thailand, they're very excited about all these things that were taking place. And there was an opportunity for them to actually conduct, like teach-in sessions. So we'll have stop classes, we'll have teach-in sessions to understand why this was occurring.
sorry,
Meanwhile,
what sessions?
teach-in. So
Pitch
it's a
in. Okay.
teach-in. This is a buzzword from the 1960s. So you would you're not going to classes. So there were huge demonstrations on campuses because of the Vietnam War, and they would boycott classes, but then they would make sure that while you were not attending classes, you had teach-ins, which focus on the topic of the day. Recently in America also, when the students went on strike, and boycotted classes, and they were encamping themselves, they had teach-ins on Palestine to understand what is Zionism, why is this conflict and what is America doing there? Why is Israel acting in this manner? So we had this concept of a teach-in. This is sort of like an informal educational sector, and so professors would just begin who were experts. So they'll teach into maybe 1,000 students. They're all seated in the field, so we'll be doing that. So it was very exciting, something new, for me.
Wonderful.
So we had
Yeah.
these teachers, and I wanted to also say that this period coincided with Indonesia's invasion of East Timor. And this was the Suharto regime. The ugly face of that regime, reared its head. And so it's again a period when there was time for us to reflect, why is this happening? Why do they deserve this? And of course, that's kicked off the start of the resistance to the Indonesian invasion. And um, somebody called Ramos Horta, and Bishop Bello, who was in East Timor. The two of them finally ended up getting the Nobel Prize for Peace, for their efforts in fighting the invasion and supporting the resistance. So, and I recall this immediately now because the Pope Francis had just visited these places, and these people were also there to welcome him, So anyway, so this was happening. So it was for me a very exciting period. And from Cornell, I decided that I would begin to, for my PhD, I had to do some studying. Okay, it was not just teach-ins and
Yeah.
like demonstrating. You had to take exams. So I did all my exams, and finally I had to decide. By the way, I majored in something called government studies. Government. So this was in American campuses at this point in time. Some universities, they began to adopt the new field called political science. At places like Dartmouth, uh, Cornell, and Harvard, we decided that it wasn't a science, so we'll continue to study government. And I think up to today, there are still departments of government, rather than departments of political science, which is actually, on the way to becoming more quantitative. Yeah. So, like Princeton, Michigan, Berkeley, these are places which began to adopt the new discipline called political science. So there are implications why some adopted, some didn't. So I signed up. I studied government. Um, I was um, had to look for a thesis topic, and I decided that I would actually come back to Malaysia to study the new villages. Why? Several reasons. First of all, because of the Vietnam War, I discovered that actually one of the tactics used by the Americans to try to control the Vietnamese people was to resettle them into what they call strategic hamlets.
Mm.
And to my surprise, I discovered that the model for organizing, this strategic hamlets was actually the Malaysian new villages. I never knew that we had these so-called new villages. So I wanted to learn more about this. So that was one reason. The second reason is, and so this is related to the whole turbulence that was going on. Number two reason was that actually um, it coincided, actually, my academic interest in the New Age coincided with this turn in the study of history, where you begin to look
Yeah.
beyond the elites At one stage, we were always focused on what did the colonial elites do? What were their policies? And then we said, no, we have to look at the sultans. We have to look at the Chinese Tauques as well, and all these, all these big shots. But it coincided with this turn in search of the perspective from below. So it comes across in different, some people call this the subaltern studies. Some people call them the underside, perspective, you know. So this, at that point in time, there were very, very few books written adopting this perspective. And I read, these books very quickly and decided, hey, this is actually the way I want to look at history, and although I was enrolled in government, but actually my thesis is a lot of history in my thesis as well. And in my case, so I'm talking about people like in Malaysia, you had Clive Kessler had published his PhD thesis. It was called Islam in a Malay State, Kelantan. So he's an anthropologist, but the first half of his thesis is actually the history of Kelantan. So Clive Kessler had done this. You had who else wrote about Lim Tek Gee, Professor Lim Tek Gee, who he graduated from ANU. He looked at peasants and the colonial agricultural policy. So he looked at actually, on the one hand, we knew a lot about the rubber industry, we knew about, tin industry, but we actually didn't know about what was happening among the peasantry. So Lim Tek Gee actually focused on these matters, and then somebody else, Clive Kessler, who else? And Michael Stanson. Michael Stanson wrote about industrial conflict in Malaysia, focus on, the industrial workers in the urban areas. So, and then later on, you had more recent books. About 10 years subsequently, I attended a conference in the ANU, and where people who had this kind of interest came together, and as a result of that, they produced this volume called Pullers, Prostitutes, and what do you call it? Prostitute and plantation workers, the underside of Malaysian history.
Yes.
Produced by the papers from that one conference. So my point is actually, this was a new perspective that was being, introduced to a lot of people. So I decided that I want to also try to look at history from below in this manner. And thirdly, I suppose the reason why I focused on new villages was that this coincided with a period of this new turn in Malaysian politics following the May 69 communal riots. Suddenly, the government was beginning to introduce the new economic policy, the new cultural policy. So it was basically a rethink on the constitutional makeup of Malaysia. What are our priorities? And as we all know, the new economic policy was an affirmative action economic policy in favor of Malays. The new national cultural policy insisted that actually national culture has to be anchored in Malay culture and other things which are Islamic in nature. So Chinese, like tarian singa, the lion dance and all that, these are not part of national culture. They're not going to ban it, but it's not part of national culture. So you don't portray this, you don't dance around, prance around as a lion on official events. So this was and then there was the new economic policy, which began to introduce all these quota systems and all that. And the rationale for that was very often the Malays were the poor people, and I knew for a fact that actually there were poor Indians, poor Chinese, and I wanted to then look at what was the reality in new villages. And I discovered actually the 1.0 million people who were still living in something like 400 new villages were, most of them could be classified as poor under the government's, you know, um, auspices, lah, under the index that they were using. And the Indians in the rural areas. And this was acknowledged in the revised Fifth Malaysia Plan when the Tun Hussein on took over. So certainly within the 5-year plan, you had one special section where they talk about we must also look into the plight of the Indian plantation workers as well as the Chinese new villagers. So in a sense, I was vindicated, you know. So again, so I wanted to study because of turbulence of the times, and this underside of Malaysian history, which needed, looking at, and also this, I wanted to intervene also in the new turn in our politics.
Francis,
So,
that's excellent. And I want to then kind of talk about your fieldwork in Malaysia. But before that, could you say something about the people at Cornell Southeast Asian Studies? For example, the two members of your doctoral committee, right? George Kahin and Ben Anderson. Any memories of them and how they were like?
oh, Ben Anderson, Josh Kahin was actually, uh, he wrote the classic Nationalism and Revolution in Indonesia. And he was, in a sense, the first scholar out of America to go and study Indonesia after the Second World War. And he went out to Indonesia because there was this new notion of we must do field work if you are going to study these non-Western countries. So he went to do his field work, which was actually a very new concept in the 1940s. So George Kahin went to do field work in Indonesia. And this was a period just after the Second World War. And Kahin then, interestingly, um, he had enough money to buy a Jeep, from the American GIs who were leaving. They had come in to fight the Japanese, and now the Japanese had been incarcerated or sent back to Japan, and the Americans were also leaving. So as they were leaving, Josh Kahin shows up and he said, "Hey, I'll buy your Jeep." So he bought one of these Jeeps from the GI soldier. And this is fortuitous because what happens then is he ends up being like the driver for Sukarno, President Sukarno. So President Sukarno needed to get around quickly, but also in some style. I mean, you don't ride a horse or go ride a motorbike. George Kahin had a jeep, so he begins to ferry Sukarno around, and he became very good friends of Sukarno. So he had sort of like an inner perspective about the Indonesian Revolution because he assessed to somebody like Sukarno. And I'm not exaggerating this because it is all recounted in George Kahin's memoir, which is called "Speak Truth to Power," and so he discusses that. So this is George Kahin was a very fatherly figure by the time I was his student. The other important thing about George Kahin was during the um, Vietnam War, he was one of the leading lights because he was a Southeast Asianist. Nobody really knew too much about Vietnam, and he made it his business to become an expert on Vietnamese Indo-Chinese history, and affairs. And then he began to get involved in all these national teachings over radio. I told you that these teachings, you don't just boycott classes and don't learn anything. No, they compensate it by having a teacher. So George Kahin would just conduct these teachings about Vietnam to, instead of a small class of 50 people, he'll be teaching to 5,000 people, all gathered on the open field, and they're loudspeakers. And he was going to debate on one occasion McGeorge Bundy, who was the Secretary of State, for I think the Johnson administration. But it didn't materialize because McGeorge Bundy had to go off somewhere. But George Kahin was very important for this. And he was a leading, and he wrote a very important book called um, The U.S. in Vietnam or in Indochina. I've forgotten the actual title. But it was about the U.S. intervention into the war. And later on, he would write another book called Intervention, which was based on the Pentagon Papers, which had been released and all that. And he would show that actually, the US was very imbued with actually China coming down to take over this region. So we better go and claim it for ourselves first. So it was this whole idea about the domino theory. China will then come down. From China, they'll go down to Vietnam. After that, they'll come to Thailand. Before you know it, they'll be in Singapore and Indonesia. So, we must hold these up as a bastion. So this is George Kahin. Um, Very accessible man, um, very fatherly. He would invite me to his house because I was a foreign student, for turkey feast, on at Thanksgiving and on other occasions. Yeah. Ben Anderson was his student, um, um, and had been recruited by Josh Kahin to come and teach in Cornell. So, but there's a maybe 20 plus year gap between the two of them. And Ben Anderson had written his thesis called The Bermuda Revolution, uh, which elaborated on one aspect of Kahin's study. Kahin wrote the classic Nationalism Revolution, which was more of a total history. He looked at all aspects. Ben Anderson then begins to zero in on the Bermuda, the young people. And his argument. This was not like a peasant uprising. This was not a workers' uprising as in the Soviet Union or something else. This was actually a youthful uprising. The young people rose up, and they were the people who had everything to gain by getting involved, nothing to lose. This. Yeah. So he documented this very very clearly. What I learned from the two of them was that actually it is absolutely important when you go out to the field. You must do field work, of course. But when you go out to the field, they emphasize the importance of actually conducting a lot of interviews. So if you look at both people's books, at the end of the book, they list for you all the people that they interviewed, and you'll be astounded at the listings. And they've got little blurbs on who are these people, what was the main role that they played and all that. And, apparently, they have transcribed some of these things and they're available somewhere in the Cornell libraries, these interviews. And this is, something that you keep for posterity. This is, like a oral history, documented. It is first, it is a primary documentation. So the other aspect which they also stress a lot upon, and Cornell in general, not so much these two people, but actually is ethnography. A live-in experience, beginning to document actually everyday goings on in the society that you are staying in, you are participating in, you are learning from. And they also they told me that this is the way, this is how you focus on these things first and foremost. They were not theoretically very very up to date. They didn't end their careers as theoreticians. For me and for them, and now for me as well, it's important to learn the theory. They provide the guides for us. The more important thing is actually the field work. And unearthing the necessary data to support any theory. So you must. So I think there is sometimes a very fetish thing going around among a lot of people. Oh, they know the latest theories. and they compete one another. Oh, have you heard of this people? He says this and this one. No, it's wrong. For the Cornell tradition is we focus on ethnography, we focus on interviews, and of course the documents, apart from the old document, but also language study, very important. Rather than actually the correct theoretical perspective, which is not to say we don't familiarize ourselves with theory, but it is not the be all and the end all.
Mm, mm. I always have a question about ethnography, right? I mean, it makes sense, right, for ethnography to apply to Americans studying Southeast Asia. What does ethnography mean for a Malaysian studying Malaysia?
Yeah, it's a very important question. My daughter is actually doing a PhD in anthropology, and she's being trained in University of Hawaii. They have a very different perspective because the special thing about anthropology in University of Hawaii is they specialize on indigenous people studies, which is a very controversial issue because indigenous people don't like to be studied by foreigners nowadays. And these people, when you are an indigenous person yourself studying your own society, perhaps you don't need to have that lived-in experience 24/7 over a 12-month period, which was actually one of the things that the old-fashioned ethnography prided itself on. You go to this island, the Margaret Mead phenomena, plonk yourself there for 1 to 2 years, follow the calendar around the clock, around the year, and you document what is happening. These people are claiming that we know the language very well. We grew up here. We have eaten the food before. We know the ceremonies. We will still go and observe and participate, but it doesn't mean we have to stay there around the clock, around the year. So this is one of the differences that's emerged, and but I think the notion of doing fieldwork remains extremely important. But the methodologies might now vary depending on who you are, where you are coming from. In my time, I did it the old-fashioned way. I stayed in the new village for about 8 months, from before Chinese New Year, through Chinese New Year, until the time I had to come back. And I documented also. And in a sense, this was necessary in my case because I was an urban middle-class boy from Penang. I wasn't actually very up to scratch about what goes on in the new villages. And I had to use Chinese 100% every day. Whereas in Penang, we use a lot of English and we use Hokkien. Here, they were speaking Hakka. They were speaking Mandarin. So it's quite different. And even though I know about Chinese funerals and things like that, it was quite different there. There was a different perspective. And of course, the most important thing was they were planters. These people were agriculturalists. And I had zero familiarity with planting anything. So I needed to do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, I just have one question on Ben Anderson. I mean, in the revised edition of Emerging Communities, he incorporated the research of others, right? Like the pre-media, the maps of Tong Chai. When he was looking after your thesis, did you discuss with him what was happening in Malaysian society and this making of this new Malaysian nation? Right? Was he interested in Malaysia, and did that shape his thinking on nations?
Yeah, I mean, there's I've mentioned this before somewhere. Ben Anderson hated Malaysia because of its very racist politics. He gets turned off because he's an Irish. And he comes from Ireland where you have this kind of conflict. He didn't like it. He liked it to be about more transformative politics. and they're building a new world, and all that. He liked that kind of politics. So Ben, in a sense, he didn't study Malaysia, but I did a 1 semester reading course with him. We read exactly the same thing. And we would read the same thing, and then he would just ask me, okay, what did you get from this? You know, and sometimes he would actually get things very different from mine, from a similar reading. And I think it's because his areas of studies were Indonesia, Thailand, and subsequently he learns, about the Philippines as well.
Mm.
So I lucked out in a sense because Ben wasn't so familiar with the nitty gritty, the details, but actually he could ask questions which were like asides, you see, and it would emerge from how come you all are doing these things like this, whereas in Indonesia they do it like that, and how come this is not important for you, whereas in Thailand it is so very important. So
Mm.
that was a good thing. I was bad. The other person on my committee I did mention is Milton Esmond. Milton Esmond he wrote a book called Development Administration in Malaysia. He actually spent um, 5 years at least working in the Prime Minister's office in Malaysia. And as a result of that, he wrote that book called Development Administration. So he's a public administration man. And he was the one who would tell me, oh, Francis, you haven't discussed this. But his perspective was from the Prime Minister's office, you see. And it was nice to have him on the committee because he would always raise cautionary remarks to me. You are exaggerating this, or something like that. So it was nice to have this, like 3 different types of people,
Yeah, sounds
sitting
like
on
a
the
good
committee.
dynamic, right?
Yeah.
I just have one last question on the Cornell group, right? I mean, who were some of the notable students, your fellow students at the time?
Who were the notables who came in with me? Takashi Shirashi, we were year
Mm.
mates. We came in together. He did history.
Mm.
His first wife, Saya Shirashi, who teaches in University of Tokyo. She's an anthropologist, you know. So Marty Hatch was an ethnomusicologist. He was in the music department. And um, high students,
Yeah.
Rujia was his second name. He was he had aristocratic status. Rujia ends up as the very important historian of Thai history, and he taught in Chiang Mai for a long time, and subsequently um, became the librarian. So
Mm.
I visited Chiang Mai recently and learned that he had passed away a couple of years ago. So I didn't get a chance to follow up, but I've seen him on other occasions. So that's Rujia. Another person was Anand Ganjana Prakon, who taught anthropology. From the Philippines, um, the people who preceded me um, was they were at the tail end of their thesis.
Mm. Mm.
Was what's his name? Rocamora, Joel Rocamora, who actually a Philippines person who did a thesis on Indonesia. You
Ah,
know,
okay.
Philippines who he was one of the first Filipinos who actually knew a lot about Indonesia. So Joel Rocamora, and his nemesis was actually um, what's his name? Who taught in NUS? Uh, Ray Ileto. So
Mm.
Ray Ileto they were competing. One was more lefty, one was more, pro-government, Marcos type of person. So they were there at the same time. And my good friend was somebody called Virginia Miralao, who ends up, running the Social Science Foundation in the Philippines. So Virginia Miralao. And she ends up as a UNESCO ambassador for the Philippines. You know, and from Indonesia, I had somebody called my roommate was somebody called Burhan Magenda. Burhan Magenda wrote a thesis on Lombok, and he himself, no, sorry, not from Lombok, from Sumbawa, and he himself had come from Sumbawa. He was aristocratic descent, so he, they directed him. Nobody has done this kind of study. Why don't you go back? What was happening there during the revolution, or subsequently? How was development? Nobody knew. So Burhan did this. Unfortunately, Burhan passed away, and then he taught in UI, Universitas Indonesia, for a long time, and he passed on maybe last year, just only. And so this Burhan Magenda. Another person who was there was Lukman Sutrisno. He was professor of sociology in Gajah Mada University, and very illustrious, developed very important center of research in Gajah Mada University in social science research, also passed on. One of the first people to be appointed professor. So I had these friends from all this. There were other people. I'm just mentioning the people who studied areas of study related to mine.
Were you the only Malaysian there?
Doing government for sure, doing social sciences yeah.
Okay,
so,
okay.
There were people doing more technical stuff.
Did many Malaysians go to do the Southeast Asian studies at Cornell?
The person who preceded me was Poh Ping. I don't know if you know the name, Poh Ping. About 5 years my senior. He also studied by Anderson. He wrote the book on 19th century Chinese society in Singapore. Yeah, so Poh Ping was there. Yeah, I'm sure I'm forgetting some of my friends. Yeah. And
can I just ask you about Poh Ping a little bit?
Yeah.
I mean, his book was quite controversial, right? On a very new interpretation of Chinese society. How did he feel about the response to his book from the mainstream?
Yeah, I remember there was a very long review of his book by Wong Lin Ken.
That's right. That's right.
And he said almost as long as his thesis, as his book, but not he exaggerates, of course. But I think Poh Ping had been imbued, one of the books during this period of ferment in America in the 70s, when student uprising and everything. One of the books that we had to read if you're doing government was Barrington Moore's book called The Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship. Everybody read that book. It was a classic. And Barrington Moore himself was, teaching in Harvard University. And this book was, for me, a very important compendium because he does chapters on the American Revolution, on the French, the British Oliver Cromwell, India. Was there a chapter on China as well? Yeah, so everybody did this in German Revolution. So he used Barrington Moore to actually study Singapore and interrogated people who looked at this in terms of British versus Chinese, or Chinese versus Malay. So he actually, and then of course people were talking about the Kongsi Gelap or the Chinese societies. Poh Ping actually turns it on his head a bit. So he's studying not only the conflict between the secret societies, but he argued that they represented contrarian economic interests. And there was a struggle taking place between a more capitalist-oriented group and a more agriculturalist-oriented group. So, the volume is very, very slim, and I think it would have benefited from more elaboration, personally speaking. But it's a thesis slide. It was actually rubbing against the grain. People looking at this, and I think it is to be appreciated from that point of view. Yeah,
Yeah. It's a very invigorating read. It's something really refreshing.
yeah,
Mm-mm. All right.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
So no, we were just talking about who else were studying in that
Yeah.
area. Um, I think the person who was from Singapore, my time was somebody called Jeffrey Seng. I don't know if you know, but Jeffrey
No.
Seng, he didn't finish his PhD, and and then later on I caught his name as a in Singapore doing some consultancy or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a the person who was with me was John Mixick, who
Okay.
ends up as professor of anthropology of archaeology in the
Mm.
NUS.
All right.
You know,
Yeah.
so yeah. But the generation before me would be people like the Andayas. I told you Ray Ileto, and immediately after my generation, some people think perhaps that was the classic group of people. You had then um, Vincent Raphael comes to study about Catholicism, the history of Catholicism in in the Philippines. I mean, and posing interesting questions. How did this take root in a place like the Philippines? Why did they mass convert in this manner? So this was what Vincent Raphael's study does.
Mm.
Of course, then we're talking about who are the people who study, and then subsequently people, who Takashi, then later on Carolina Howe, Carol
Mm.
Howe, they are sort of so they are my juniors lah. So it's usually you enroll yourself, then you go off to do your fieldwork, and then when you come back, oh, you meet the new students, the people who are and this quite a very interesting um, way that we connect with one another. And I must say that actually um, the, the fact that I studied at Cornell and the fact that I studied with Ben Anderson and Josh Kahin, it always precedes my reputation.
Mm.
So I taught in Monash for 5 years, 4 years, in Australia. And in a sense, when I first went to present, they were more interested, exactly like you are interrogating me now. What was going on in Cornell at that time, rather than Francis Lowe. What is your area of interest? What is your? So they evaluate you. Okay, this one is a. Are you a chip of the same block or not? So there's that kind of a thing going on. So
Well,
receiving
among the the students, right? Was there a great interest to know beyond their own area of study or where they came from to see Southeast Asia as a region?
Um, I think there were some, but
Mm.
very limited. Actually, many of the people who came over, like somebody like me, I was a science student. So it's just that I abandoned the sciences and began familiarizing myself with the history, the culture, the languages that I needed to do my field work. And a lot of the other people also had these kinds of problems, lah.
Mm.
Unless you were somebody like, say, Taufik Abdullah, who ends up writing a whole compendium, 10 volumes of the history of Indonesia in Bahasa Indonesia, But prior to going to America, to Cornell, he was already a historian, of Indonesia. And he wrote a classic book, but at the same time, he was already very, very well informed about the history of his society. Yeah.
Mm-mm. Great,
Oh,
great.
another
Yeah.
friend of mine, I should mention his name, is Tan Chi Beng. Tan Chi Beng, Professor Tan Chi Beng was an anthropologist. He studied the Peranakan. He was my contemporary. We went there at the same time. He was the first batch of anthropologists trained in USM. So he came there, he went there to study the Babas and Nyonyas. His book has recently been republished in Malaysia. But Chibeng moves he started off in NUS, then he moves to University of Malaya, then finally he moves to CU Hong Kong.
Mm.
And New Hong Kong, he then subsequently goes over to Sun Yat-sen University. And he begins to then, drawing from his experience doing field work in Malaysia and in Sarawak, he begins to actually do field work in China itself.
Oh.
And his works are quite interesting because he has this comparative perspective, you know. So in a sense, I started off, your question is actually, are we encouraged to study other countries and all that? I'm not sure that they were directing us in that manner,
Mm.
but what for sure they insisted upon us is that we have to learn to be comparative. I'm a comparativist,
Mm.
and I had to do a whole course on Indonesia. Another, we call this the country survey courses. I had to do something on the Philippines, something else on, I didn't do Thailand, but Vietnam. So I did that. And that, so that actually, when I encounter some new book about Vietnam or Philippines or Indonesia, I know how to locate the book because I know the other literature, the important literature related to that topic. So this is, and when I study Malaysia and all that, and I want to say something, I can draw an example from in the Philippines, on the other hand, or in Thailand. And I think this is something that I've taken from Cornell. It gives me an edge in a sense. I look at Malaysia, I have a comparative framework to look at Malaysia. And it is important because all the time in the social science, um, we must actually connect the small picture to the big picture, small to the big. And maybe they are medium-sized pictures of your region, but this is this is actually the good thing about the American graduate
Mm.
studies program
Mm.
because it is grounded in disciplines and you have to do coursework. You don't just become an expert in the topic of your thesis. It's for me, and then when I came back to Malaysia, it was very easy for me to begin to teach different kinds of uh, courses because I could draw on, my readings that I'd gone through in the past, my notes, and upgrade them, update them. you know. But this was the advantage lah. Over my friends who graduated from the UK or from Australia, where they are very much more grounded. They emphasize actually
Yeah.
your thesis.
Uh, so just to reassure you, the podcast is on Francis Law. So you are still the topic of the podcast.
The What I want to mention is that I think I am a scholar. Um, you see, my new village introduced me to the topic to look at politics from, in a sense, the bottom up.
Yep.
To look at, social science, social realities, politics from the bottom up. And throughout my academic career, I've tried to maintain that perspective because I think it gives me a cutting edge. You know, Throughout my career, I have not gone to Putrajaya to peruse through the speeches of some authority, and interview these people. I've not done that ever, but I have done, this perspective from the bottom up. And subsequently, after this, I went to my second area of research was actually Sabah. So I spent about a few years in Sabah. Not sorry, I spent a few years studying Sabah and went there regularly. Went there regularly. And actually it's a very different society from Peninsular Malaysia, let alone Penang. I mean Penang, let alone the rest of Malaya, because the whole colonialism there was very very different, and so that actually allowed me to draw on my comparative perspective to make headway. So but this perspective is not from the bottom up so much as from the side, as it were. And I don't know if you know of a work of somebody like Jojo Abinales. Jojo Abinales is a professor, who studied Mindanao. He was at Cornell as well, a few years my junior. So he studies Mindanao politics, and then he then looks at the martial law that was taking place, under Marcos through very different perspectives. When people say, "Oh, the declaration of martial law occurred on this day," in 'I've forgotten what year, 1970 something. Jojo Abinales will argue, no, it started much earlier. In the Mindanao, he already bombed, Holo, island of Holo and all that, much earlier. So Jojo, there's this perspective of looking at things from the periphery. And why is this important? Because actually in these places, the state is relatively weak. The state is very strong, identifiable. You can mark it quite clearly if we're talking about the city, the city center. But when it gets to the periphery, the state is not there. It doesn't work 24/7. And very often it's represented by the strong man. The strong man represents the state. And it gets very, very arbitrary. Rules get banned, for these purposes and all that. So, for me, this was the perspective. The second, another area of research I then worked on was I actually did a study um, about the Indians in Penang, a minority within a minority group. Penang is dominated by the Chinese, but the marginalized community is actually the Indians, not the Malays, because the Malays actually get benefits from government and so on. But these are poor Indians. And why are they in Penang? Many of them are, and I'm talking about the Prai area, Butterworth side, as well. People gravitate there from all the plantations, which are, being taken over, the plantation industry doesn't thrive anymore. So they go and hang out, in Seberang Prai area, and so I did the article that I wrote on the marginalization of Indians in Malaysia. I offered it to Ben Anderson in his thesis, and I'm very proud of that study because I'm already midway in my career, but I undertook a completely different topic. You know, it was for was focusing on the Indian Penang. So I went to observe Thaipusam, how do they do it, MIC politics, So for me, it was very exciting. And lastly, I just want to say, that I focus a lot on um, what I call not big P politics, but small p politics conducted by, NGOs, civil society. And I've written a lot, done a lot of research, play around a lot with the um, civil society groups like CSOs, NGOs. And I think, and because, when in this new literature, when you talk about people being able to, negotiate around, the rules, and if you don't, you must, what my study actually helps to show how people can negotiate around the rules of the game and survive, and yes, they're all very rigid, tough laws, restrictions, but actually they don't know how to enforce it 100%. And they're always what we call in Malaysia the lubang, the openings where you can creep into and you can do something about it. And this comes from um, influences. Jojo Abidales does that when he studies Mindanao. But I'm talking more about also this Professor Joel Mcdowell, who writes about small societies, no, strong societies, weak states, strong societies, weak states. And there's a whole series of publications coming out from under his leadership. from people largely from the University of Washington, Seattle. And they look at in China, you can negotiate around, find the lubang in China. Case studies of Palestine under the terrible hegemonic Israeli regime, you can still, create a Hamas, for instance. So it's a so the laws are one thing. The constitutional frames are very important, but actually it doesn't determine the ebb and flow of everyday politics. There are other factors involved. So that's why I'm very attracted to this way of looking at things. You look at it from the side, look at it from the bottom. It will be quite different.
I really enjoy this podcast, although we talk a lot about Cornell and all that, but essentially it kind of comes back to you and the way you look at the world and the way you do your research, right? So there's an intellectual history there, there's also a personal story there.
Okay.
Okay. I'll be in touch.
Okay, then.
Let you know. Thank you so much.
When will you get this thing done?
Over the weekend, pretty soon lah. There's very little to edit anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. See you. Bye.
Talk soon again. Bye bye.